Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Perceptive podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. As always, I am Josh Beiser, and we have another great cast lined up today. We are returning to the topic of modern retro games and game design, and my guest tonight is the co-founder of the studio 6502 Workshop, who just finished a Kickstarter for very much a game that could be described as modern retro. It is Nox Archaist, and this is a old school RPG designed explicitly for or designed around the Apple II and will also be available on Mac and PC. So please welcome to the podcast tonight, Mark Lemmert.
Thanks, Josh. Appreciate you having me on.
It is great to have you on, Mark. How are you doing today?
Excellent. Couldn't be better. I'm nose deep in a bunch of 6502 assembly language code, and that's where I like to be.
All right. I'm sure a few of my programmers, their ears just perked up when you said that, too.
Excellent.
But it is great to have you on. I guess start with, definitely congratulations on the success of the Kickstarter. For people listening to us, when was the Kickstarter for Nox Archaist?
Thank you. The Kickstarter was in May of this year. It ran from beginning of May to end of May, and we successfully funded it roughly 500% of the goal. It really was a wonderful success, thanks to everybody out there in the retro community that supported us, and much appreciate their help.
Yeah, congratulations on that. We certainly have a lot to discuss tonight, especially with talking not only about modern retro design, but the very fact that you are very much building it for that old school style Apple II.
Absolutely. That's a really fun way to approach it from my perspective, and certainly look forward to talking with you more about that.
So to begin with, since this is your first time on the cast, Mark, for the people listening, could you talk a little bit about your background in the industry, as well as what is Nox Archaist?
Sure, absolutely. So I guess what I would start by saying is my love of RPGs started as a kid in the 1980s, like it did for many people. And my family got an Apple II Plus around 1981. And I spent basically my childhood playing games like Ultima and Bard's Tale and learning programming as I tried to create similar games. And it was going through, those iterations that I acquired many of the skills to be able to write a tile graphics in for a game like Nox Archaist in a 6502 assembly language today. However, despite being on a career track for game development, at least programming, things kind of took a different turn during the internet boom in the mid-1990s, and I ended up getting into network engineering and eventually finance and business management in the software industry. So, this project, which started about 4 years ago with Nox Archaist, is, it's really, I feel like I'm coming home, back to where it all started, so to speak. And I haven't had this much fun in, as long as I can remember. It's just been a blast. So that's kind of where I come from at it. And from that standpoint, being that I haven't, racked up 20 years of experience in programming, my skills in that area, had to be definitely some development had to occur on them as I went, but I feel like, it all balanced out. I also, was able to bring to the table the finance and business management skills to be able to approach a project like this and see it through to the end, dealing with the sort of the non-technical challenges that often can, derail games that go onto a Kickstarter and, don't have good enough forecasting and budgets to be able to, know what they need to raise and manage the vendors and kind of make it all happen. So I think it's gone really well, actually, in all respects, both technical and the kind of the project management side. You'd asked more about to tell actually more about Nox Archaist. Here I am talking about this abstract thing. So, like I said, Nox Archaist started about 4 years ago. The project. It is a sword and sorcery style role-playing game, heavily influenced by the early Ultima and Bard's Tale games, especially Ultima 5. the last Ultima title released on an 8-bit platform. The game will run on authentic physical Apple II hardware on real 5.25-inch discs, or on a Mac or Windows PC via an emulator, which will likely bundle in so that it's transparent to the end user. So basically, the goal of the project, to put some context to it, is to pick up where commercial development of 8-bit RPGs left off in the late 1980s, when most developers switched over to the PC. So we basically are intending to, and largely have, given we're in the late stages here, we want to see what kind of game would have been possible if 8-bit development had just continued past that marker in the late 80s. So to this end, while standing on the shoulders of giants, we've been able to achieve gameplay with features that dial in somewhere between Ultima 5 and Ultima 6. In essence, we've found that when the big switch happened away from 8-bit onto to the PCs, there was more capability within the 8-bit platforms, at least the Apple II, that could be squeezed out and would have been squeezed out, had by developers like Origin and others, if development had continued on those platforms. So it's been really, really fascinating experience from that standpoint, and exploring, what else was possible.
And right there, that's that's a very interesting discussion in of itself about kind of making use of older hardware in this kind of style. Because when we talk about kind of the quote-unquote modern retro markets we think of today, whether it's with studios like Mega Cat Games, Yacht Club, Loco Milito, and a slew of other developers, there's always there's always two sides of this. You either have developers who make a game using modern hardware and technology, and it's built to emulate that old school style. Or it may take things even further. And then we have developers like yourself, I know Mega Cat has done this, who literally will use that old hardware and that old assembly language to build their games out of. And it's pretty much you are literally building a game like they did back in the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah, I hear you. I see both approaches out there, and I haven't tried it the other way, as far as using modern technology to emulate the retro environment. But I'm certainly familiar with what's happening there, and it's interesting to see how it all unfolds. I mean, ultimately, I think both approaches are fundamentally very interesting. The doing it on the original hardware, there's a couple of reasons that I decided to do that. One is because for me, that was very central to this motivation that I had to basically finish what I started as a kid, and always wanting to make a game like this, and did not achieve that as a kid. And so now it's to really go back and pick up where I left off and do it, I've got to go back to the hardware I was working on, to really feel that sense of okay, I finally did it all these years later. So that's one factor. Another is that I think that there is something, the sort of the secret sauce of what made those 8-bit games so fun. I think part of it is they were born out of the constraints of the platform. And if you live within those constraints, the 128K of memory on the Apple, IIe, and what is it? I think half megahertz processor of the 6502, you just have to do things differently and do them in a certain way that, just forces you to, I think, ultimately develop much more engaging game mechanics and story, because you're not going to capture the player's interest with the other kinds of things that can be done in the more modern platforms. Even an RPG that's being developed to be a retro RPG on a modern platform, I think it would be difficult to sort of force oneself down to that 128K half megahertz sandbox, when you don't have to, So as a result, I think that sort of the easiest way, not that this is easy, but the easiest way to really recapture that 8-bit, secret sauce, if you will, that made those games so fun, is to just actually do it, on the real hardware and force yourself within those constraints.
And that's a very interesting aspect of game development as well. Something that we've talked about on many casts, whether it's live recorded, and about kind of like the importance of set constraints when you're trying to frame your thinking or build a game around it. Because as many independent developers know, especially in today's market, thanks to many free engines available, you can do whatever the heck you want. Like, there's very few limitations if you're trying to build something in Unity or Unreal, other than just the time and energy needed to do that. But the downside, of course, is that if you're given freedom to do everything, it becomes very hard to focus on what you really want out of that title or that design.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a trade-off there for sure. And the Nox Archaist game engine took 3 years to build.
Yeah.
And the last year has been creating content. And there's definitely something to be said for starting with a game engine and focus on actually building the game. Of course, that's not really an option on the Apple II because there is no open source game engine that you can just like a Unity that you can just use and then build your content on top of.
Yeah.
People have asked me, say, hey, are you going to make like a construction set out of this engine? Yeah. I always say, well, lots of future projects under consideration, but we'll get this one done first. So yeah, it is. It is definitely going the route of creating the engine definitely adds another layer of challenge to it. And honestly, I had no idea it was going to take this long. I'm not sure. I'd like to say that if I knew how long it was going to take at the beginning, that I still would have done it the way that I did it. But I don't really necessarily know that that's true. At this point, it's kind of like, well, 4 years in, lights at the end of the tunnel. We're gonna see it through here, but it's definitely been a lot of work.
Yeah, and I think every developer has said the same thing. I didn't think it was going to take that long.
Right? Yeah. Some of the greatest things get done when you don't know any better.
Yeah. And regarding kind of like the technical or hardware side of things, for people listening, you know that I am definitely not a programmer by trade, but I do have a few questions to kind of set you up with that I'm sure you'll be able to run with in a few minutes about kind of the hardware side of making this. Now, one question I want to ask you, Mark, in terms of like your own like game dev career, is Nox Archaist your first game, or did you work on other projects or titles beforehand?
I would consider it to be my first. It'll be my first game that gets completed. The only other games that I worked on were as a kid in the 80s. Like I said, when I was going through that experience of playing games and then trying to write them and basically learning how to program. And I never finished anything back then because it would be like, okay, I'd get a ways into it, and then I would learn a better way to do it, and then I would start over because, of course, I wanted to do it the better way because I could make the cooler game. A combination of that and getting distracted by the next Ultima when it came out invariably would lead to, the last thing not getting finished and, being easier to kind of start over rather than figure out what I was doing before. So I went through a lot of that. And then really Nox Archaist is my foray back into this. And it is definitely, as I understand it, quite unusual to take on something this magnitude as being without having at least completed games under your belt. That is, I guess, just a function of my stubbornness and determination to make the game that I always wanted to make. And I don't know whether there'll ever be a Nox Archaist 2, so this is like, if this is my only crack at this, I want to do what I originally, I'm not going to mess around with, taking step 1, 2. No. I'm just going to go in there and do it. And I've got I know from past experiences in my career with very complicated and large projects that I have the staying power to see it through. And as mentioned, this is 4 years in at this point, so hopefully that illustrates it. And additionally, I've learned a lot over my career about the value of building teams and, knowing what you don't know, and things like that made me more comfortable with diving in. Basically, once I was able to tell that I could really get a handle around 6502 assembly language and implement sort of the conceptual designs that I had done in the past for tile game engines, I thought, okay, I think I've got the technical chops to really do this or do most of it. And but I knew, oh, hey, there's a lot of other elements to games. There's like, well, what about the story? What about the statistical systems and the balancing, the tweaking, and things like that? And what sort of happened there is a team kind of evolved. 6502 Workshop is actually a group of like 12 people, and what I found, is that to do a project like this, you need the skills, the motivation, and the time. And something like this hasn't been done on the Apple II in over 30 years because apparently nobody had all three of those things. And until I came around and was, perhaps foolish enough to dive in and do it. But what I did find is that there were a lot of people, once I had a proof of concept out there, there were a lot of people that had some relevant skills, definitely had the motivation and had a little bit of time. It's like, hey, they'd always dreamed of making a game like I did. Weren't in a position like I was to sort of be like a one-man show with it, but could contribute a little time here and there. And as a result, that's made the game a lot better than it would have been if I had done it all myself. For example, in the area of art, I'm not an artist. We got a great artist, Bill Geege, who's doing, basically all the tile art and portrait images and things like that. Or music. Music has been, not a strong suit of mine. And so we got some community contributors there, like Eric Rangel and Tom Porter and someone who goes by the name of Electric Moo that have been doing music for the game. Much better than I could have done. And kind of back to the original topic of what gave me the confidence to tackle something this large is I was able to get in touch and basically recruit for the team some professional game developers with a lot of experience that have basically acted as project advisors. And so I've been able to have the access to people to brainstorm with things like the storyline and statistical systems and basically get a lot of good advice on how not to back myself into a corner and have to start over on massive portions of the game, things that would typically be learned from, doing small game number 1, small game number 2, and getting more and more comfortable with the size and the scope. I sort of dealt with my lack of knowledge in that area by getting a lot of good advice and doing some drafts of like the story and the stat systems, saying, hey, can you take a look at this? Where did I mess this up? And kind of go through some iterations before committing it into the code. So long answer to your question on, I think you'd asked about, is this my first game? So there you have it.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to like this kind of passion in game design, it's something that we've talked about again when it comes to the independent scene, that many people get into it like their first game is that one dream game, that one they've always wanted to make, and by God, they're going to make it no matter how long it takes.
Yep, exactly.
And like when it comes to Nox Archaist and just like old school like CRPG design, I guess. Like, for myself, like, people who listen know that, for me, I didn't really get into RPGs probably until the late 90s, early 2000s, and that was more on the JRPG side of things. So, what attracted you, or what were, like, some of the major things that really stood out to you about CRPG design that you really wanted Nox Archaist to represent?
Well, I think that I've just always had a passion for the two-dimensional tile interface, to CRPGs, and there it just wasn't even a question in my mind that's what it was going to be, and I always loved that. I liked dungeon crawler games that had kind of more the 3D view as well. And one thing that I liked about them is just based on the way they managed their screen real estate, they had room for portrait images of merchants or mobs or different things, and that was something that the 2D tile games, in fact, I either didn't have or didn't typically have. I can't think of one off the top of my head that had that. So that was also something kind of early on that, I thought about as, I'd like to kind of take what I like the best out of two different CRPG styles and merge them together a little bit. So what evolved with Nox Archaist is, it's a 2D tile game fundamentally, but we leveraged in portrait images in various circumstances for things like the merchants, and for things like you're at the end of the battle and the treasure drop comes. You get a nice, like quarter screen sized image of a pile of high res, for the Apple, image of a pile of treasure. And that, so I really enjoyed seeing how that kind of wove together. And that also kind of touches on, and I think fits in well with the topic of CRPG elements, is something else that I tried to do was, think about what had been done in the past in terms of 8-bit CRPGs, and think about, well, what are some of the sort of the game UI quality of life features that evolved that maybe could have been done in the 8-bit environment if they had been invented. And we actually had a fair amount of success, I think, in doing that. For example, the typical 8-bit 2D tile RPG from the 1980s would have a small view window that you were seeing that 2D tile map that was maybe half the screen or a third of the screen. And then the remainder of the screen real estate was taken up by a list of characters, like a character roster, and then a text window where you would see, like, if you're talking to an NPC and things like that. So what we did was we said, well, this was an experiment. This was one of those, let's see how much horsepower and resources could be squeezed out of the Apple II kind of experiment. We said, well, can the 2D tile engine run on an Apple II a full screen viewport into the map? And we didn't know. Nobody had tried it.
Yeah.
And it turned out the answer was yes, you can do that. It is possible to do that. And once we got into the full screen, is possible mode, and thinking about, what modern sensibilities we incorporate, it's like, okay, can we do pop-up windows? It turned out answer is yes. So, and you basically have to, if you're going to do a full screen viewport to the map, and not reserve screen real estate for things like character roster and text window, you pretty much have to. So that worked out. So where we ended up was we've got pop-up windows for all sorts of different things. They're deeply integrated into the UI. You talk to an NPC, you get a pop-up window. You want to look at the character roster and get into player stats, more pop-up. Ultimately, you get into inventory, not just a pop-up window, but we have menus for like weapons and armor and spell books and things like that, where you tab between the menus and you use arrow keys to like scroll up and down a list. You want to ready a weapon, you hit the enter key. You want to unready it, you hit the enter key. Removing from the equation the typical 8-bit CRPG interface of the day was often something like hand item B, which you had to remember was dagger, to player 3, and then press R for ready, number 3 for player 3, ready, press B for B. I sat my nieces down one time. They wanted to play some of the old school 8-bit RPGs, and I sat them down playing one where you had to do that, and they just looked at me like I was crazy.
Yes.
You have to do what? How do you do that again? And they've played Nox Archaist and its more current iterations, and went through the menu system, and they were able to pick it up. Even modern kids. Now, granted, I'm not expecting that Nox Archaist is going to be something that most kids would play, because unless they had some particular reason that they had an interest in 8-bit RPGs. But just seeing the fact that they could get the hang of it fairly quickly, whereas they couldn't with the original ones from that era, gave me a sense of accomplishment of, okay, we did something useful here that should, even for players that played back in the 80s, I think will appreciate it. And just like, I don't think that's where the fun was in those games. It was not fighting with the clunky UI. The fun was elsewhere. So we did some things like that as well.
Yeah. And like for myself, I remember like a few years ago when GOG like first started, I picked up the original Might and Magic series. Like never played them.
Oh, sure.
I load them on. Like, what the heck is this interface? Like, there's no mouse control. It's just like a bunch of key commands. I'm like, no, I don't have the time to figure this thing out anymore.
Sure.
But it's very fascinating. We were just saying there about kind of taking like quality of life inclusions that we see today, or even those that could have been possible, and in a way like retrofitting them for this kind of design. Because again, like for a lot of like the younger people or first time students like listening to us right now, when we talk about stuff like pop-ups or hotkeys or information panes, that kind of stuff is it's standard. It's as common as breathing.
Yeah, exactly.
But like for a lot of old school games, like again, like for all the old people, all of us oldies listening to this right now, like we remember like those older style titles that back then there was no such thing as kind of like UI conventions or standardization. Like I've said this before, but while XCOM UFO Defense is one of my favorite games of all time, it is a horribly rough game to go back to if you've had no experience with it.
Sure.
And that was just kind of how games were developed back then. Like, nobody could have thought that we would be having a multi-billion-dollar industry and, teaching design and having people, have that as a potential career back in 1988, 1992, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It was the Wild West, of a great many things back then. When it came to game development, UI included, and it was an adventure for, especially if you didn't have the manual just to figure out how to fly the plane, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And go ahead.
I was just about to ask you a question, but finish your thought first.
Oh, I was just thinking about manuals and there were a few games that I did have the manual too, but many I did not.
Yeah, it's always fun trying to play these older games. I have like no idea. Again, like kids these days, they get tutorials and YouTube videos. Back then, we just had to just keep pushing buttons and hope something happens.
Oh yeah, exactly. The whole concept of the manual is gone, and that reminds me something I just wanted to share because I just got it was such a delight to read, to kind of like understand where things were and where we're at. I don't remember where I saw it, but it was an article of a teacher of taught courses in modern computer science, basically in, I think, a game development specialized program. And he said something like, you have to call computer science game development to get anybody to sign up anymore. Mm-hmm. And went on to kind of describe like, well, there's a point in the class where, he's having them play games, and there's a point where he has them like play Ultima 4. And he's like done this for 20 years. Mm-hmm. He said it's getting to a point where it's just almost impossible anymore. And he said the last time, previous year, where he had the kids play Ultima 4, they just couldn't grasp it, and would come back with all sorts of different questions. How do you do this? How do you do that? And he would tell them like, well, that's in the manual. It spells it here. I'll show you where it is in there. And did you read the manual? And they're like, the manual? Where was that? He's like, well, it's the when we started, I gave you the stuff that, and they're like, oh, I just thought that you have to read that. I just thought that was the stuff that came in the box. He's like, well, no, really. In order to play the game, you have to read this to know what to do in the game. I'm like, wow.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me of a story like when I was giving a presentation at a library about the rise of the arcade industry, and I talked about online multiplayer. And I had to explain to this teenage girl about back then we had dial-up modems, and you had to choose between either going online or calling somebody. And she gave me this look like I just described, like some ancient technique, like how the pioneers used the internet back then.
They're like you were inventing the wheel or something.
Yeah. But yeah, again, so much about design these days. I think a lot of people don't quite grasp just how much or how far things have come. We really didn't start to see standardization practices and things like that until probably early to mid thousands. And even with that said, we're still seeing those kinds of issues today with trying to get people interested in a game, and that first time experience, is worth its weight in gold for a lot of developers.
Yeah. I think I can appreciate where you're coming from there, just in terms of in the modern developing modern games. My understanding is you've got to hook the player within the first minute 30 something. And there's if you expect them to read anything, forget it. You've already lost them. So totally different world now.
Yeah. So here's a question I have for you. As you were saying a few minutes ago, when you were kind of figuring out what you can or what you could and couldn't do on the Apple II hardware, were there any quality of life or I guess experimentations or things you wanted to put in the game that it just couldn't work? You tried it and the system, the hardware just was not letting it go.
Let's see. Is there anything? I'm sure there was. There isn't anything that jumps right out to me that fits into that category. But there definitely some of this has just been. It's been 4 years, and the experimentation part of this happened in the first year and a half, and then I deliberately kind of forced the project to get disciplined to have a more and more defined scope, and march towards that. So yeah, I made notes, and I know at some point I want to write something about this whole experience, so I'm gonna have to go back to those notes. I'm sure there was. Some dead ends along the road.
Okay. Now, with regards to I'm trying to think of what else I wanted to ask, because I have a few questions regarding the hardware side. I'm trying to think of anything else gameplay related. I guess one thing that I was curious about. Now, obviously, you've played a lot of old school CRPG design, and I was just wondering, were there any aspects of modern day CRPGs that you either thought about including in the game, or that you want to kind of try to avoid or steer clear of?
Sure. Yes and yes. So definitely I was influenced a lot by skill-based systems and systems with trainers, which I was not exposed to until well beyond the 8-bit era. I'm not sure when those systems were first introduced. But to me, at least, that was something from the post 8-bit era, if not more modern era, that I thought was really cool. I love skill-based systems, classless skill-based, I should say, and I like the concept of it being intermingled with trainers. So you've kind of got a couple different ways and strategies you can take towards managing your money and managing your time and developing your characters. And so that, to me, that was one of those things where it was okay, well, can this be done on an Apple II? Is there a reason that it can't? Is it just too complicated to store the data for that? Or is there a problem parsing the data fast enough when it needs to be parsed in order to make things happen? All sorts of technical considerations rolled up into that, and ultimately it turned out that it was possible. That's exactly what we implemented, was a classless skill-based system with trainers, and so that worked out as far as something that wanted to include. As far as didn't want to include, I absolutely did not want to go anywhere near the dynamic in many modern games where the breadcrumbs for the player got to a point of from my perspective, taking away the fun of exploration.
Mm-hmm.
And, for example, the extreme would be the question mark is hovering over the NPC's head who gives you the quest, and you get the quest, and then you follow the dashed line on the map to get to the quest destination, and so on. And as far as, is that even possible in an 8-bit, would be a question, but I am aware of another 8-bit in development in modern day that has done some things along that line with those kinds of breadcrumbs. And I'm not going to say their name because otherwise it might sound like I'm kind of picking on them, and I don't mean to be. I respect their efforts, but it seems that it is possible if you prioritize your resources towards that to do something along that line. And I, from my perspective, it's like I don't care if it's possible. I don't want that. I want a game that's going to encourage exploration. That's going to, you're going to make maps, you're going to love it, or you're not going to love this game. And have a notebook, a physical notebook that you write things in, just like in the 1980s. That's the way it was done. And to me, that was fun. And to many people, that was fun. To many people, that was not fun. It's kind of one of those things. You either like that style or you didn't or don't. But that was definitely a deliberate design decision as far as not incorporating that particular element of modern games.
Okay. Are there any examples of modern CRPG design that you really enjoy? Not so much to put into Nox Archaist, so maybe just that you play like on your free time.
I'm sorry, what's the question? Are there any games that I play? Modern games? I haven't done a lot of game playing while I've been doing the Nox Archaist development, just as a matter of discipline. However, yes is the answer to your question. Before I got engrossed in Nox Archaist, I loved playing Skyrim. I played it start to finish. Well, not that there really is a finish, but as a practical finish several times. I absolutely loved that. I'm not sure if I would have loved it as much if I had played the earlier Elder Scrolls. The more I learn about the earlier Elder Scroll games, the more I understand why the people that loved those were disappointed in Skyrim. But, well, ignorance is bliss. I loved it. And I also played Shroud of the Avatar. I took actually a little bit of a break to do that when the official release happened. I think that was a year ago, last spring, and had some fun playing that. And as far as other modern games go, I'm sure there's a few others, but those are the ones that came to mind.
And like as you were just saying, like with regards to the appeal and almost like the repellent to some people of these old school games. It's always like that in of itself is like a podcast or two, like a worth of discussions. Because we've certainly seen, especially this decade, with the rise of Kickstarter and crowdfunding, kind of like allowing these smaller and niche kind of designs to flourish in a way. Again, like stuff like Nox Archaist, I think Pillars of Eternity was kickstarted as well. Like there's definitely a market for these old style or these old school style CRPGs, but there's always that trouble, or there's that challenge of how much you want to add modern conveniences. And will adding this, while it may make the game different, is that distracting from your original message or concept?
I think that is a key consideration and dilemma ultimately. And if as a developer you're going to prioritize, the size of your market, that's going to lead you to, do a lot more of those modern convenience type things. And I think it's a fine line and a slippery slope. At what point do you go so far down that road that, like you said, it's no longer really reflective of the original vision, and then you lose, sort of the more hardcore, part of the audience. And I don't think there's anything wrong with doing it that way. It's just a different way of doing it. And I knew right from the outset that I was all about modern conveniences, but I don't want to take away from the, that secret sauce of what, made the 1980s 8-bit CRPGs so fun. And I thought, if it's something that was just an annoyance even to, the hardcore players, then sure. Like I said, I don't think anybody necessarily really got their kicks out of making it complicated to move items between players and ready them. I mean, maybe there will be somebody that writes in that says, "No, I live for that." That to me didn't seem like that was a thing. Or in conversation, talking to NPCs, it's a very Ultima style, Ultima 4 and 5 style interface for that, where you put in the name job by, sort of a thing. You type in the keywords that in some keywords the NPCs will respond to, and some that they won't. After they've given you their introductory spiel, or they've responded to the job question, they tell you some stuff. In Ultima, you were guessing. It was I think somebody described it as it was the guess the noun game. When they the NPC answers the job question, you guess which noun they're going to elaborate on, and then from that response, you have to guess again which noun are they going to elaborate on, to kind of ring out the quest information from that NPC. And so that was another one where we decided that playing guess the noun was not really something that anybody probably found all that fun. It was just something you did, and the rest of the game was so fun, you just went with it. So what we did instead was we capitalized the keywords that the NPC will respond to, and that gives a similar sort of a experience to the way it worked in Ultima 6, where they started highlighting the keywords, and then of course you had mouse support and you could click on them, or even Shroud of the Avatar today. When an NPC responds, there's text on the screen and there's keywords that are highlighted, and you click on them, and that's how you talk to people in Shroud of the Avatar. So in Nox Archaist, of course, you have to type the keyword in, but at least you're not guessing what the keyword is. And it doesn't remove the experience, and this is important, it doesn't remove the important experience of, well, maybe you don't know to ask John about the magic sword because you haven't yet talked to Fred in some other town who tells you, well, you should go talk to John about the magic sword. That mechanic is still alive and well, because magic sword is not in John's conversation text that is visible to the player just based on asking name, job, and things like that. You have to get the clue from the other NPC to know to ask John about the magic sword. So that all still works just fine. So that was another case where we thought, no one was going to miss that. But as far as anything else went, we thought, if this is going to take away from that original 8-bit CRPG experience, then even if it is more convenient, and even if it is possible on the platform, we're not going to do it, just to stay true to the vision, to your point before.
And that kind of discussion about changing the text parser interface, that kind of thing, again, it's one of those examples that you're keeping what the spirit of that design, but you're figuring out a way to make it more digestible to modern audiences. Again, the inventory UI, that right in there, it drove me crazy playing those old school games. I'm sure it drove a lot of other people nuts as well.
Yep, absolutely. And then we look within that sort of context. We look for how can we then push it along the next step. And like with the text parser, since we were on that subject, what we did there to sort of push the envelope was we added the construct or game mechanic of voice mode. And when you're talking to an NPC, you can select between 3 different modes. You're either yelling, you're whispering, or you're talking in a normal voice, and it defaults to normal voice. And you'll get different responses from NPCs based on are you yelling at them, or are you whispering, or what? And in many cases, it's just kind of a silly sort of a response, like, "Hey, what are you yelling for?" But in other cases, it's a puzzle, a game mechanic for puzzles. Like for example, maybe somebody tells you to go and talk to John in the pub, and ask him about the treasure map, maybe he's not going to want to talk about it there if you're yelling at him or even talking in a normal voice. But if you whisper it to him, maybe he will tell you about it, or maybe he won't even tell you about it then, but he'll at least acknowledge that he knows about it and say something like, well, not here, implying, oh, well, maybe there's another time in a less busy place that John will tell me about this, and adding a dimension of time into the mechanic as well, as far as when NPCs will tell you things. And neither of those elements of tone of voice or the situational awareness was present in any of the other conversation systems that I saw in the 8-bit realm. So that was one that we added in there, which will hopefully be a fun mechanic.
Mm-hmm. And that actually leads me to the my last question, gameplay-wise, for you about Nox Archaist. And that was, as you said, that you've been trying to, one of your core visions for the game was to kind of say, okay, if people were still developing games for the Apple II, this would be like that kind of evolution or that iteration. From a design standpoint, are there any other major examples you can think of game systems or game design elements that kind of fit with that mold? Something that's in Nox Archaist that could have existed if people were still developing, but still is unique to this one.
Sure. Something that is unique to the Apple II 8-bit RPGs. I'm not sure on the other 8-bit platforms on this one, but unique to the Apple II is we basically we've got some pretty impressive special effects for spells. Mm-hmm. And to put some context to it, on Apple II, in a tile RPG, you cast a spell, and pretty much what you were going to get was the screen would, get inversed into, white and black, and you'd get a sound, and, you would get a very basic looking shape, like a blue target symbol that would kind of fly towards the whoever casting the spell towards, like if it was a fireball spell. That's kind of what you would get. So what we did is we still have the inverted goes to white and inverted black screen and the sound and all that, but what we added in was a more of a representation of what the spell was doing. Like for a fireball, we have a graphical shape in the size of a tile that looks like, it looks like flames, was done by an actual artist, looks like flames, and that shoots across the screen to the target that you specify, and when it gets to the destination, it explodes, and fire tiles appear over the affected area. Or my personal favorite is the lightning bolt spell. You get an actual lightning bolt that looks like a lightning bolt artistically, white and blue jagged edges kind of thing, along with an electrical shocking like sound, and you see that lightning bolt shoot out from your wizard to impacting the target, and that kind of thing just didn't happen, and especially not in a way where it was like going jailbroken from the tile grid. Typically, a tile game would rigidly operate within the tile system, and it's like you're casting the spell north, south, east, or west, and that's what you're dealing with, rather than, well, I want to target this enemy that's at an angle, and then when I shoot off my lightning bolt, have that lightning bolt just kind of go at an angle from the player's icon, to the mob's icon. That sort of thing just didn't happen on the Apple II before, because that was like mixing arcade style graphics and the tile system kind of graphics, and there's a number of technical reasons why it was really hard to do and not really commercially practical probably to do, and why it wasn't done, and things like that. But that was something where we just put in the time and saw it as an opportunity to push beyond, and we're able to get it in there.
Great. And before we move on and talk a little bit more about kind of the programming side and the hardware of Nox Archaist, Are there any other elements from a gameplay or game design point of view that we didn't touch that you would like to cover now?
Just real briefly, I wanted to emphasize story.
Okay.
The Nox Archaist has a very deep and rich story. It's not like a combat-less, adventure game like some, were. It's definitely there's combat in the game. Combat is very central to the game. But it's not, just a grinder either. There's a very rich story that the player is navigating through and solving puzzles and quests and keeping them engaged. And the combat kind of gets mixed in around in between of that. And even goes so far as to have story combat integrations, like, maybe to defeat a particular boss monster, there's no way you're going to do it if you haven't learned things through exploring the storyline, tips that are going to somehow let you know what his weakness is, or maybe actually in the course of combat, the boss starts, talking to you, telling you things like, oh, gonna have to pay attention to this. So the goal there was basically to create a engaging experience that was going to be not just a adventure game with no combat, but not a grinder, kind of go, somewhere in between and just sort of holistically spend more time on the story than typically was spent back at that time, given the pressure of, some of the production deadlines and things like that.
And like we were just describing there, more like that's one of the more fascinating things about what I hear of a lot of the old school CRPGs, that they're not really focused entirely on, as you said, like just pure combat. There is a story. There is this idea of exploration. There's a lot of adventure game aspects into old school CRPG design.
Yep, absolutely. And, that's something that, I think has been lost to some extent, over time that we're trying to recapture.
Mm-hmm. One other quick question that just came in my mind. As you were describing like the various ways you can play and solve solutions, you mentioned earlier that you're going for a classless-based system for like character development. Like, what is, like, obviously I know I play a lot of RPGs, I know what that entails in modern games, but how does that work for Nox Archaist with giving the player just like, do they just have like free reign to learn everything?
Essentially, yes. This will weave into something else that might be useful. The startup of the game is very simple. Mm-hmm. You start with one character, and you're not rolling stats or anything like that. You basically choose a race. You get a traditional human, elf, dwarf, that kind of thing, which will give you a very minor bonus in the character's stats based on that. But it's really more window dressing than anything. So very quickly, somebody's up and running in the game. They're not sitting there creating a party and rolling stuff. You can have up to 6 characters. And what you do is you find them, through going into towns and castles and talking to NPCs. Some of them will join your party, and that's how you fill up the other 5 slots. You can there's also spells for summoning and things like that too that would be on top of the 6. So anyway, that's some context to the question. And so when you start like that, other than your slight bonus based on which race you chose, you're in a position where you can develop your character down kind of a magic path, or more heavy weapons and armor path, or more get into range weapons, or kind of do some of each. You can really just blend that any way you want. It's fully open in that respect.
Okay. Nice. And like that kind of design, like keeping with like the freedom to explore, I guess, are there any like passive or I guess non-combat skills that players can learn in the game?
Yes. So the skills, I might miss one or two, but off the top of my head, there's skills for melee weapons, ranged weapons, for dodge, parry, critical hit, lockpicking, and pilfering. I believe that's the list. It certainly is not a lot of skills compared to any kind of more modern game. This becomes a reflection of what could the platform support. I was just thrilled that it was able to be done at all, but it's enough that through some of the play testing, we've confirmed that it's fun. It's enough to be fun. and it basically it reinforces our character development model. It really stands up very well because even though it's open as far as how you develop your characters in whichever direction you want, you're making important choices, and the farther along you get, the more developed your character gets. Like, if you're going to go down the path of, kind of the traditional fighter, you got attributes of strength, intelligence, and dexterity, only 3. You're going to be, when you level up, you get points to apply to increase your base attributes, which are distinct from skills. And you're going to want to put those points on strength if you're going to be a heavy weapons and armor kind of a fighter.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to want to work on your melee weapons skill, which you do by basically engaging in melee combat, and there's trainers and things like that. And if you roll along for a handful of levels and then decide, oh well, I really want to cast some spells too, you can do that, but you're developing that your spells from the beginning. You're not going to be casting level 5 spells like you might be using level 5 equipment, because that's what you've been focusing on. You're kind of starting at the beginning of the tree, if you will, if you then want to get into magic. So the decisions on what skills you want to work on and what base attributes you want to increase have a very significant meaning with how your characters develop and how they perform in combat and in out of combat situations, getting into the ones like lockpicking and pilfering and things like that.
And again, when we talk about things from a design standpoint, we could be here all day just describing things. As a quick time check, we are just about at an hour in. So I figure I do want to talk a little bit more, or at least give you the chance to talk a little bit more about kind of programming the game. I'll have a few, I think, Kickstarter-related questions for you. So I figure maybe another, I would say maybe 30 minutes, if that works for you.
Sure. Okay. Yep, absolutely.
All right. Back to it in 3, 2, 1. Yeah, and again, like when we're talking about like CRPG design, JRPG design, like these topics can fit their own podcast, and we're not careful, we'll just be here all day long talking about this stuff. But considering like a major part of Nox Archaist was the fact that you were developing this for the Apple II and then kind of porting it to modern systems, I want to give you a chance to kind of talk a little bit more about what that's kind of been like. Because again, I know a lot of my audience are programmers. I'm sure they're going to eat this part up. So,
sure.
Like I said at the start, I am not a programmer by trade, so I'm sure I'm going to ask you a lot of stupid questions. So just be prepared for them.
No worries. Ask whatever you'd like. Did you want me to start out with just kind of like an overview of what it's like, or how did you want to begin?
I think probably like my first question will have been more of like an overview or kind of like where it all began. So I'll let you take it away.
Okay. All right. Well, so basically, I in my research and development stage of the project, I was writing some code in 6502 assembly sitting in front of my Apple IIe. I was using an assembler called Eliza, and literally doing it the old-fashioned way, like it was done back in the day. And I spent a fair amount of time, probably a couple of months, doing that. At the same time as I was doing that, I realized that there were cross assemblers and other options for doing development, but I wanted to make sure that I had a good feel for assembly language on the real hardware. I had done a lot of programming on the Apple II and other languages, AppleSoft and so forth back in the 80s, but not so much in assembly. So I got myself a good 2-month immersion on the real hardware with 6502 assembly, and then set out to basically develop my tool chain and build pipeline into something that was going to be more practical and scalable to approach the project. Now, granted, back in the day, people developed whole games on the Apple II and things like that, but I didn't think that that was necessary from my perspective. To feel fulfilled, I didn't need to do that. And the end result of what I was going to be able to produce was going to be, I would be able to get something done, that was better, faster, if I leveraged, some of the more modern tool capabilities. So that leads me into, finding a cross assembler. And there's a variety of cross assemblers out there. CC65 is popular. Merlin 32, another big popular one. Acme is another. I ended up settling on one called SBASM. And there's pros and cons to all the cross assemblers, but basically, if all you want to do is write 6502 assembly language code, SBASM is perfect for that. It doesn't distract you with other capabilities that might be great, but if you don't need them, are just one more thing to kind of navigate around. So the cross assembler sits on a Windows 10 machine, and I write the source code, the 6502 source code, in Notepad++. The cross assembler takes as an input, just text files, as is typical in a lot of modern programming. So what the cross assembler does for is it basically allows me to get the efficiency benefits of using a mouse and copy and paste, and not having, being limited to labels that are like 4 characters long, because that actually, takes up memory and disk space somewhere, which on the Apple II is a big deal and not a big deal on a modern computer. But it matters for efficiency, not having to remember what, this 4-letter label actually means, because I can make it 20 characters long. That's an efficiency thing. So that's really the benefit of the modern tools on the programming end. It doesn't do any of the work for you. You still have to, lay out the assembly opcodes and, think through the logic and so forth. You run a build on the cross assembler, and it gives you a binary file in 6502, and you can then plug that into an emulator. Well, you have to get it onto a disk image, but you get it onto a disk image, you can then plug that into an emulator and then see the results of what you programmed, and is it doing what you want to be doing, and start the debugging process of going back to your code and fixing things, and run the cross assembler again and fire it up in the emulator and so forth. And I've got that very automated, so that with batch files, basically. When I'm done writing a chunk of code, I basically run go.bat, and it builds the binary files and copies them into the right directory, so that the emulator knows where to find them. And I mean, I can be seeing the results of what I did on screen in like 60 seconds, basically, which is actually probably kind of a long time for a modern computer. But the cross assembler I'm using is built in Python, so there's a bit of overhead to that, and we're up to 300,000 lines of 6502 code, so it actually takes, even on the modern computer, a full 60 seconds to put that all together. And then with the Apple II hardware, where that comes into play is every once in a while, we do most of the testing in the emulator, but every once in a while we need to test it on the real Apple II hardware just to make sure, because there are bugs in the emulators, and the emulators will sometimes let you do things that the real hardware won't. So they kind of have to check back home from time to time. And for that, I've got a serial cable connected into like a USB to RS-232 serial adapter plugged into my modern laptop, and then serial cable that plugs into one end of that, and then into the printer port on the Apple II. And so then on the Apple II side, we've got some software written by somebody else in the Apple II community that basically grabs the bit stream off of the printer port and bundles that up into the proper format, and then writes it off to floppy disk, 5-inch, quarter-inch floppy. So when the time comes to do the test on the real hardware, we run our build 60 seconds, and then we fire up the software on the Apple II that that grabs the bit stream, and that's maybe a 5-minute process to then get it out onto floppy disks. And then from there, we can boot up the floppy disks on the Apple II and see, is this what we're expecting? So that's kind of overview of the programming, the coding side of the process. The other aspect gets into like tool chain for developing art and that sort of thing. And at first, what I did with that was I got out the graph paper and marked off which pixels were on and which pixels were off on a tile, a 2D tile size piece of the screen, and converted that to binary, flipped it around, converted it to hex, put that into the source code, and saw on screen, okay, is that the graphics that I'm expecting? Did that a couple of times and decided that's enough of that. That was literally like how Richard Garriott did it for the Ultimate games on the graph paper like that. But after doing it a few times and sort of making sure I had a handle on the process, I then set out to build a tool for creating 8-bit art, 8-bit Apple II art specifically. So Apple II has its own graphics rules different from other systems, which are pretty insane. But so we've got a tool for that our 8-bit artist Bill Gigi uses for creating his stuff. And it takes some technical knowledge. Not any artist would be able to use that tool. It's fortunately Bill was he grew up with Apple II computers in the 80s and had some familiarity with some programming elements, things like that. So we were sort of able to bridge the gap between us with a tool that enabled him to do his art a whole lot more quickly, not have to horse around in binary or hex, but still had to kind of keep in mind some of the bizarre rules of the Apple II, like where you can put colors and where you can't, and some stuff like that. But all in all, another huge efficiency gain there as well, in terms of creating the art rather than it being all done on graph paper. It being in a tool like that, was a huge efficiency gain. So as a result, the efficiency from the cross assembler. And from that art tool, the end result is we're able to do a game on the scale of like Ultima 5, with a much smaller team. Even though there's a dozen of us involved, most people don't have a lot of time, and they're contributing where they can here and there. I'm contributing a lot of time myself, but if you added it all together, there's maybe one or two full-time employees worth of output happening there, whereas Ultima 5 was built by a team of like 12 full-time people. So over a span of, I think, 5 years, and we're coming up on year 4. So that's I'm just putting some math to it to illustrate the advantage of that modern tools bring to developing on the real authentic 8-bit hardware. It's definitely a time gain that's realized by that. And as a result, we're able to put the time into some features that just wouldn't have been commercially practical back in the day, without those time efficiency saving tools.
As you said earlier in the cast, you spend like the first 3 years of development simply like coming up with the tools and the engine that you want Nox Archaist to be. Correct.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it was... at that 3-year mark, we had proof of concept demos of all the things the engine could do. You could kind of cruise around on a map and, see the animation and, enter in a town, and, a town that was perfectly pointless to do anything other than walk around and just observe. Oh, hey, yes, there's merchant, et cetera. We had those kind of, demo-like things at the year 3 mark, but what happened at year 3 was then, okay, now we need to actually write a story and develop statistical systems and start to create the actual content that players are going to see. And that process only started a year ago at the year 3 mark.
And I think that's very interesting about you trying to create like your own tools in a way that still fit within the Apple II architecture.
That was definitely a interesting part of the process as well, and it was there was a lot. How would I describe that? It was like it took a lot of knowing the really low level architecture of the Apple II, basically, to really just kind of nail down what exact format did things need to be in. And understanding how some of the some of the tools, like I said, there's a program on the Apple II written by someone else in the Apple II community that's like grabbing the bit stream off of the parallel port and writing it to floppy. So we had the advantage of a couple of really low level tools that other people had written as well, and we had to really understand how those tools worked. What format were they expecting? It was a lot of stuff that sort of had to line up between the real hardware and the actual content we were creating to just make sure everything can talk to everything else. That was really the exercise in the tool creation.
And I'm sure somebody's listening to this probably I'm going to ask this question, but what was again, obviously with Nox Archaist, you wanted to build this game to emulate and kind of iterate on the Apple II style or on old school CRPG. A few minutes ago, you said about emulation or using emulators to kind of test things, but they would still not be the best version. So I guess what was the main reason not to build the game entirely using emulation, but having to build it explicitly on the Apple II framework and design?
Sure. So with emulators, first thing I want to say on that is that they're actually very good. Apple II emulators are very good, and they will play the games from the 80s, and you will get an experience that is very close to real hardware. The main difference is there's a little bit of differences in the way the graphics look on screen, but you'd have to be an Apple II graphics expert to tell the difference, honestly. So as a practical matter, no real difference there. The main thing as a player, you're going to notice the difference of is, the keyboard feels different, and you're looking at it on a modern monitor as opposed to, on an Apple monitor. So from a player perspective, a player's going to get a lot of enjoyment playing, something that's running an Apple II emulator, if fundamentally that's the kind of game that they want to play. But if for convenience, doing it from an emulator versus, well, they don't have an Apple II or, whatever, nobody should feel like they're not going to get a very authentic 8-bit Apple II gaming experience out of an emulator. You will. The reason that we felt that we needed to do the development on the Apple II or have the Apple II in the development process is because there's the way the emulators were built, as it was kind of like, all right, so we're building an emulator. Does it work with Ultima? Does it work with Bard's Tale? Does it work? Make sure that you're going to make sure that it works with the big 80s titles, right? And that's like your testing cycle if you're building an emulator, an Apple II emulator. And you get it to a point where it does, then until somebody reports bugs, there's not really much else you can do as a developer. Mm-hmm. And since we're building something from scratch that's new, invariably there's going to be things that we end up doing that are just, slightly different than perhaps was done, in other games, including we actually, one of our team members rewrote the entire floppy disk controller that Steve Wozniak wrote in 1979. Totally rewrote that and made it faster, and which has enabled some cool features in the game. But that introduces a different sort of dynamic that's going on at a really low level in the way that the game runs that just didn't exist in games in the 80s, because in the 80s, everybody was using Steve Wozniak's disk controller that he wrote in 1979. That's just the way you did it. So as a result, we'll have situations where we run the game in an emulator and it works just fine, but we run it on real Apple II hardware and it crashes. And we have to basically diagnose, well, what's the bug in the emulator where it's not basically allowing a legal 6502 operation to occur. And you could say, well, all right, get it from programming standpoint, but who cares? Why not just do it in emulation and people just play the game that way and they don't know the difference? A couple reasons. One is there's actually a lot of people who want to play it on the real hardware. We did a poll a while back of, okay, are you going to play it in an emulator? Are you going to play it on real hardware? Are you going to play it on floppy? Are you going to play it on hard drive? Because you could actually put a hard drive in some of the Apple IIs. And it came back about 50-50. So there's actually a lot of people who want to play it on the real hardware. So that's one reason we have to get it right on that. And I have a lab of Apple II computers of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Apple. Every major model of Apple II, I've got it in my lab here for doing that kind of testing. And the other reason to do it is because the emulators. It would still be possible to stumble into an emulator bug problem, even if the intention was for people to always play it in emulators, because there's a handful of different populator emulators out there. And creating something new, it's still possible to do something a little bit differently than had been done in the 80s games in terms of the raw machine instructions going through the emulated CPU. And have it work in one emulator and not in another one, and then at that point, if you're not checking it against real hardware, it's like, okay, well, where's the problem? Is the bug in my code? Is the bug in emulator number 1? Is it the bug in emulator number 2? So going back to the mothership of the real hardware as the final authority is really helpful in determining where the problem is. And the emulator developers have been great. I'm friendly with most of them, if not all of them, of the major ones, and they're great. I report bugs and they fix them, and we keep it rolling.
And it's definitely fascinating to talk about again, having to the emulation versus the original hardware like that, and the fact that. Again, for a lot of people, at least more on the mainstream side, they will just go immediately to the emulation. But as you said, there are going to be those issues where if you're just working purely on that, it becomes a lot harder to figure out, where those problems are coming in at.
Definitely. Now, to be fair, one approach we could have taken would be develop the game to run an Apple II emulator. That's the only way it's going to be released, and basically create a proprietary closed environment where we bundle the game with an emulator. Mm-hmm. We don't expose the actual disk images to anybody, so they're playing they'd be playing Nox Archaist in an Apple II emulator that's running behind the scenes that they'd never see. They'd never have the ability to run it in a different emulator or on real hardware. But it would feel like an authentic CRPG because it was still developed within the 8-bit constraints. That would have been another way to go, theoretically. But that wasn't the way we went, largely because of the interest in people. I guess playing it. I would say playing it in real hardware. Not to mention that when the project started, I wouldn't have considered that possibility. I just kind of spouted it off. Now, theoretically, we could have done it that way. I wasn't thinking about it in those terms at that point. So, and what we expect to do at this point is that when we deliver the game, we likely will bundle it with an emulator so that it's as simple as possible. If people are going to play it on the PC, don't make it hard for them. We'll likely, if all goes according to plan, have it bundled so people can just click on an executable and it runs like any other application. But the disk image will be distributed with it, and if somebody wants to download the disk image and run it in a different emulator, they can. Or if they want to download the disk image and write it off to floppy and run it on real hardware, they can. And of course, I didn't specifically mention this, but we've have a boxed set version of the game, just like the 80s, full color professional artwork game box with a printed manual, cloth map, and feelies in the box, and 5 1/4 inch discs. So that's the other way for people that want to play it on real hardware rather than writing it to floppy yourself and going through those technical hoops. If you get our collector's edition in the game box, the floppies come right in there, as well as a USB stick that has the emulator version on it as well. So it's kind of a package for everything.
I guess here's a question. I'm not sure if you would know this or not, but like in terms of like people having access to like Apple II, or even just like I know there's in the modern retro scene there are third-party versions of third-party platforms that can run NES games or Genesis games or etc. Is there like a booming or just some kind of market for people wanting to play like the original Apple II?
Yeah, there are people out there that there's a thriving Apple II community, I should say, and there's a convention every year called Kansas Fest that's been going on since the 1980s. In the 80s, it was a Apple II convention that was like held in hotels and things, and all the big vendors came and stuff like that. And the rest of the world moved on from the Apple II. But Kansas Fest didn't. It just kind of kept going, and it's a really unique convention. It's held in Kansas City in a college dorm on the Rockhurst University campus, and people come from all over the world every year to Kansas City to this convention and stay in this college dorm. And we all act like we're college kids and fool around with our Apple IIs and stay up all night coding, and it's a week of fun. It's like summer camp for nerds is probably the best way to describe it. And so yeah, I mean that's an example of the thriving Apple II community today, and the hardware is still out there. It hasn't failed every year I've gone 3 years in a row now. I walk into the commons of the university dorm where it's held, and never fails that there's just piles of Apple II equipment. You can't hardly walk to get through, the commons to get to the stairs to go up to your room. There's so much Apple II gear lying around, stacks of Apple IIes, stacks of Apple II GSs. And there are people there that are still into it, and the hardware is accessible. It's not hard to find, and if you don't have to even go to Kansas City to get it, just hopping up on eBay, it's not hard to find, the original Apple II gears. So it certainly is not like a huge market or anything of people that are, still into playing games on the real hardware, but it's definitely there.
Right. Now, this next question, I'm not sure this is either going to be a very long or very short answer for you. I think it's going to be on the long side. But one thing that I want to ask, and again, this is like coming at it from somebody with not a programming background, but like obviously when I think about game design, I had the same discussion with another indie developer, this was I think a few months ago, about he was creating his own engine from scratch to build his game, that when a lot of people, including myself, think about game design, or at least modern game development, we think about things using a game engine. Again, Game Maker, Unity, Unreal, you name it. That is kind of like that wrapper, or that the thing that creates a game and you export it. Mm-hmm. With building Nox Archaist, and again, I think you said this earlier, like, there is no quote-unquote Apple II game engine. Like, there's not an engine out there that you're just using. Like, what is like kind of like the process of building a game like this? And again, I'm sure this could be like an hour-long answer if we're not careful.
Sure. Well, let me take a shot at this. And I've been asked by a number of people to write a book on how to make a 8-bit RPG on the Apple II, because there isn't one. So that's the first thing to know about what it's like is there isn't even a book out there that says how to do this. There's a couple of books out there like on arcade games on the Apple II, which is useful. You can learn some things about graphics with that, and I read several of them, but that's maybe a tenth of the total information. So doing it from scratch without the benefit of knowing anybody who had done it before, which was the position that I was in when I started. All I had was my own knowledge that I had developed in the 80s of experimenting with, getting tile engines to work, programming them in AppleSoft, which not powerful enough of a language to do it. But so that's kind of what I went into it with. And it was very heavy on the research development. You have to be very patient and be willing to chase down information. I mean, I was spelunking around in like old CompuServe news groups that had been rolled up and archived into like, comp.sys. Whatever the, and Google's hosting them now. But like literally as I'm searching for different, keywords to try to find out things about like bootloaders and other esoteric topics, I'm like getting hits off of, messages that are in these archives, and I look at the date and it's like 1991, so there's like these breadcrumbs of information out there. So I had to, do a lot of experimenting, a lot of tracking down of information that was getting very close to being lost to history, and being very patient as I then, sort of did one thing at a time. That's really, the art to it. Like, for example, let me give a concrete example. So, okay, you're on the Apple II, you want to print some text on the graphic screen that you're going to have, your tiles and everything else going on. You just want to print some text, like the character's name. It is not even as simple as like in BASIC, even in AppleSoft BASIC, you might say something like print the command, like print and in quotation marks your character's name, whatever it is, Bob Johnson, and then it prints text to the screen. Well, you can't use AppleSoft because it's too slow. You got to do it in assembly language to get an RPG up and running of any size that's graphically based on the Apple II. So in assembly language, it's like nothing is done for you. You want to put print text on the screen. You've got to write the routine that is going to like take as an input the hexadecimal ASCII value of each character, and for a given hex value for an ASCII character that's input in, like for the letter A, all right, now you want to print the letter A, you got to write the routine that then goes out into video memory and turns on the pixels, which is all, like in binary for what pixels on, 0 is off, 1 is on, in the position on the screen that you want the A to be printed in. And so you got to have some parameters for like, okay, well, where do you want it? That goes into your subroutine, and you've got to use those parameters to adjust the memory address in video memory for where you're turning those pixels on. And the addresses in video memory aren't even in sequential. It doesn't go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It goes in like clusters of 256 bytes, and they're mixed up and backwards because that's saved in the number of chips that were put in the computer originally, so that that challenge got passed on to the programmers to then sort out this non-sequential video memory address scheme. So you gotta deal with that stuff. You gotta sink your teeth into those problems and come up with solutions to them. And ultimately, I was in the process of doing this, doing a fair amount of reinventing of the wheel. The people that made the games in the 1980s, certainly had to solve these problems and write code to do them. When I started the project, I didn't know any of them. I know some of them now, but and some of them don't even remember all that much necessarily about things 30 years ago either. So that is a microcosm into what it's like to create a game engine from scratch on an 8-bit platform like the Apple II. The other 8-bit platforms, it's going to be different, but it's going to be similar, in many ways as well. And so you have to have a lot of tenacity and patience to do one microscopic thing at a time and be excited the first time you see the letter M printed on the screen, which you could have done in 5 seconds in BASIC, but you did it in assembly language, and you're going to be thrilled about it. And if you can see something like that as a victory and find that fun, then maybe you can get through 3 years of doing one thing at a time and building on what you did one little piece at a time. It's not for everybody.
Mm-hmm. I guess that takes me to another question then. Like, now that the tools have been built and you have everything that you need, like, how fast is it now to kind of like implement an idea or add something to the game compared to, when you were still making things in terms of the tool side?
Much faster. The efficiency gain with the tools is orders of magnitude. Like, for example, a tile on the game, which is like 14 pixels by 16. The amount of time that would take to do the art on to do the art in the tool and then see it on screen, depends on the complexity of the tile, but designing the art and putting it on screen can probably be done in like 10 minutes. Now, there might be some refining of the art, to make it look just right. But first iteration, maybe 10 minutes. And 8 minutes of that is actually just, doing the art, itself. And if we were talking about doing it the old-fashioned way, where you do the art on graph paper, you manually have to convert the pixel layout into a series of binary values, flip the binary values around in reverse, and then convert it to hexadecimal, and then code the hexadecimal into your source file. That could take hours. And then you do all that. You take the couple hours, you do all that, and I made a mistake. It doesn't look quite like I expected. Where was the mistake? Was the mistake in the layout in the graph paper, or was it within which of the 5 mathematical conversions that I described? Mm-hmm. So really, that 2 hours magnifies by another factor for margin for error. So there's just no comparison. It's orders of magnitude more efficient with the tools. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said a few minutes ago that people are asking you to write a book about designing an 8-bit RPG. Are you considering doing anything in terms of releasing the tools you've developed or having them available for people to work with on their own?
That's another thing that people have asked me about, and is another project on sort of the future project list. And my thoughts around that are, first of all, that at some point I intend to make the Nox Archaist source code open source. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure when that's going to be. I mean, certainly, I'm trying to raise some money, with the initial release of the game and things like that, given the amount of time and effort that was involved with it and other things that I could have been doing. But at some point I want to make it open source, which will be a good learning tool right there. As far as being able to take the source code and actually do something with it, that's kind of a whole nother order of magnitude of project. And to get to the point where there's a RPG maker based on the Nox Archaist engine, I think what that would take is somebody partnering with me that was interested in a project like that, and where they what they thrived off of and thought was fun was building tools. Because ultimately, I'm not a tool guy. Yes, we made some tools. They're way efficient compared to not having them, but that's not the kind of programming that's really my strong suit or what I enjoy doing. It would really take somebody where that's their thing. And people who love designing tools typically don't like writing game engine. So I could totally see some point in time getting together with somebody that enjoyed writing tools and getting together on a project like that, where I kind of explain, here's the inputs into the game engine. Go write some tools that put them there in a user interface that is, friendly. And I'll work with you on, the troubleshooting and advising and things like that. I'm open to the possibility of a project like that in the future if a partner came along that brought those other things to the table. But I think that's what it would take. I don't think I'd ever get there myself.
Okay. Yeah, and especially with something like Nox Archaist, with the fact that this originally started as being your dream RPG. It wasn't to create your dream tool set to make this game.
Exactly. That you hit the nail right on the head. Couldn't have said it better.
Yep, and this has definitely been a fascinating conversation. I will admit this is a bit over my head in terms of my knowledge base when it comes to game design, but like I said, my audience does include a lot of programmers, and I'm sure They are loving this. And if we were doing this live, I bet like this part could probably go on for like a few hours of people asking you programming related questions. I guess a few final wrap up questions for you, and then we'll probably end the cast. And like we were just saying, like if you're free in the future, we can always have a follow up, whether it's live or recorded.
Sure. I would welcome that. It's been a lot of fun talking with you here today, so I definitely would welcome coming back. And we probably could do something live in the future, too, if you think that that's something your audience would appreciate as far as being able to ask questions, etc.
Yep. But here's my last programming related question for you, Mark, and then we'll do like our wrap-ups set. So for people listening who may want to either experiment with the Apple II or look up resources, were there any like useful sites, books, tutorials, whatever that you were using while you were kind of like building the tools, or even just what you're still using now to build Nox Archaist?
Sure. I can rattle off a number of things here. A good site is 6502.org. That's just a wealth of information on 6502 assembly language programming. And a great book. The book that is really my go-to book for 6502 assembly language is called Using 6502 Assembly Language. Real amazing title there. And it's by Randy Hyde. So I would recommend that book. Another great book is the Assembly Lines Cookbook that I would highly recommend. And that's been basically, it's a book that was recently published. That's a compilation of the column called Assembly Lines from, I think it was the old Nibble magazines in the 80s that, would have like programming tips and things. And it's been put together in book form. I think that's on I'm not going to remember the website name, but if you just Google Assembly Lines Cookbook, you'll find the site for that. As far as other tools that are useful getting into the Apple II, ADT Pro is a really great tool. That's the one that will allow you to transfer a disk image transfer a disk image from a modern computer onto a floppy disk where you're running it over the serial cable connected to the printer port and all that jazz. Getting into a little more of the technical side there, but if somebody wants to get on the Apple II and basically download software online, Apple II software online, and then put it on the real hardware, that's the program you're going to want is ADT Pro. The site that you'll want for finding the disk images of all the old Apple II software is called Asimov. It's a big FTP server. And another one is archive.org, the Internet Archive nonprofit organization that's the host of like the Wayback Machine and some other things related to archiving. They also have a tremendous archive of Apple II software. And yeah, I think that's probably some good getting started stuff. There's definitely more beyond that, but that should get anybody started.
Great. And I guess one final question. I'm not sure this would be taboo or not to say, but as you said, like there are Apple II emulation, and emulation in the game industry is a very hot topic among game preservation and even just major companies. Is it, I guess, quote unquote, legal to use like Apple II emulation, like to play these older games?
Okay, so to your question about emulators and the legality of emulators and playing the 1980 software in them. So the emulators themselves are, depending on which one you use, sometimes they will have you download the Apple II ROM file and insert it into the directory that the emulator uses. And in that case, the emulator itself is perfectly legal. And because you as the user were the one that downloaded the ROM file that would have been on a chip in the original hardware to put in there. Some emulators basically just decide it's not a big deal and it's bundled in there. So it depends on which emulator you get. As to the software itself, you can download disk images of any software that is almost any software that was ever made for the Apple II is available on disk image, at least in terms of games. There's a lot more missing, like on the productivity side. But in terms of games, you can download almost anything. Copyrights run for 80 years, 100 years, something like that. So definitely, the games are still, technically under copyright. I basically, the way I think most people look at it is, well, under the fair use law, if I owned a copy of this software at one time on physical medium on 5 1/4-inch discs, if I download a digital copy and then I'm using that, I'm just using the same software just in another form. So that's another dimensional side of it. Do people download disk images and run them in emulators where they've never purchased the software? Probably. In the 1980s, there was plenty of played games and ran software that they had not necessarily purchased. So I don't think anything has changed in that realm. In terms of like, have I there being any lawsuits by the copyright holders of Apple II software, basically bringing anybody to court for playing those disk images or even for hosting those disk images where they're downloaded from? I have never heard of any single instance where that has happened. I'd be probably a bit surprised if it was, because this stuff is just so old and irrelevant from a commercial perspective at this point that it's just hard to see a business rationale for a company to invest money in doing that. The exceptions are occasionally there's a title where it's still actively in use, and the company that has that copyright is a bit more concerned about it. And I've never heard of even a company in that situation pursuing any individual people because they downloaded the disc and they played it. But what will happen is in the few cases where it's still an active title, what'll happen then is they'll send a cease and desist letter to archive.org. For example, and archive.org will either take it down or not take it down, depending on, how they judge the merits of the claim. Archive.org is a nonprofit that is backed by a very wealthy person that made a lot of money in the .com era, and has enough muscle, so to speak, that archive.org does not get intimidated by just willy-nilly cease and desist letters getting thrown around. They'll take things down if it's legitimate and reasonable, but they've kind of got the community's back as far as not letting big corporations kind of trample all over the retro scene.
And again, if we start talking about preservation such, that is another massive topic when it comes to these kinds of discussions. But I think with that, let's begin to wrap things up, because again, there's so much more we can talk about, and I'm sure the audience is either very attentive, their eyes may start to glaze over for all of our discussions here. But
one or the other, yeah.
Yeah. But it has definitely been a great time talking with you today, Mark, and it's just fascinating about being able to design a game kind of with modern eyes, but with that retro look or that retro appeal and that retro methodology to it.
Absolutely. It has been an incredible amount of fun, and I'm excited to be getting into kind of the final stretch here. We're shooting for a release date next spring, and we're actually now accepting pre-orders. So for anybody that missed out on the Kickstarter, if you'd like to take advantage of the pre-order discount, just click the pre-order button on noxarchaist.com. And if you'd like more information on Nox Archaist, you can sign up for our mailing list on our website, or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @6502workshop, or also on Facebook, where our page name is Nox Archaist, no space.
Great. And you actually answered my next question about where to find you guys and when the game was coming out. Great. You did the work for me.
Excellent.
I guess with that, then, my final question for you this evening is, do you have anything you'd like to say to the fans or supporters listening right now?
I would just like to thank everybody that is still involved in retro computing for, sharing, the passion that I do. It would be much less interesting of a thing if it was just something I was doing myself. And I didn't know when I kind of got into this project that, there really was much of a retro community out there. And so thanks, everyone. I love getting interacting with people. I love getting feedback on the game, and as it's been developed, and we put out gameplay videos, and I'll be certainly looking forward to when the game is released. Just kind of living vicariously through the players as they post feedback or ask questions or throw up YouTube videos, and that wouldn't be possible without the thriving community that is out there. So thanks much. To all of those folks for that, and anybody listening that backed our Kickstarter, a very special to you. You're what is making the box collector's edition possible, and that is a definite big part of the fun and excitement to me as well.
Awesome. And yeah, next time we have a chance to talk, I definitely want to talk more about the physical goods side of things. So that I was looking at the Kickstarter pages before the cast, and I just love the idea of all the crazy things you have in that. And just like, again, like you've mentioned like several times casual, we're going to ship with floppy disks. And I am very sure that there is probably a small percentage of people listening to this right now who have no idea what a floppy disk is.
Right, yeah, exactly. It's like, what are you flopping?
Mm-hmm.
You're flipping and flopping. That's what you're doing. Yeah, that's well. There's pictures. Go to Kickstarter.noxarchaist.com. You get some pictures of floppy disks.
Mm-hmm.
And we're one good reason to follow us on Twitter is we're doing a lot of posts about the progress of game development and the arrival of the Feelies on Twitter. We're doing it in backer updates too on Kickstarter, but Twitter is kind of the more informal, shoot something out. And so just the other day, I posted a picture of, box after box after box of 5¼ inch floppy disks when they arrived. And the week before that is, a whole pile of boxes full of maps and boxes of game boxes, So as the physical goods are starting to arrive, we're having a lot of fun sending out pictures of that. And also of the like I said, of the game development. I'll typically on Saturdays for Screenshot Saturday on Twitter, I'll post a screenshot of whatever I'm working on. Like, another ruin today. Here's what this looks like so far.
Great. Oh, and I guess one last question I just want to bring up for people listening. How long do you expect? Like, how long on average do you think the game will take to finish? For, like, somebody interested in it.
Well, kind of shooting for a spring release. Is that what you're asking?
Oh, no, I mean, like, length of the game. Like, is it going to be like a 30-hour, 40-hour, that kind
how long will it take them to finish, not how long will it take me to finish?
That's another topic.
Well, it won't take you 5 years. So I would estimate that it's probably a 50-hour game.
Okay.
And that's about what Ultima 5 was. So that's just to put some context to it. So, it's going to be, as 8-bit RPGs go, it's definitely not a short one. It's going to be one of those that, keeps you playing for a good long while and immersed and et cetera. There's a lot of content.
Awesome. All right, so I think with that, we will wrap things up for our cast. Again, Mark, definitely congratulations with the success of the Kickstarter. And I'm sure there are a lot of people, a lot of your fans who are eagerly waiting to play this. Like I said, CRPGs have always been kind of like one of my blind spots, but it definitely sounds like something that if you are a fan of this kind of design, that Nox Archaist is going to just fit that bill perfectly.
Absolutely. I think it will. And thanks so much for having me on today.
Not a problem. So for everybody listening, we're going to end things here for our cast. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you'd like to follow me, you can follow me on Twitter @GWBicer. We have a Discord channel open to everybody. There should be a link to it in the description of this podcast. And be sure to check out the YouTube channel where I have daily videos as well as live interviews with game developers. But if you are a developer working on your own game and would like to come on, please don't hesitate to get in touch and come back for another great discussion on the art and design of games right here on the Perceptive Podcast and on Game Wisdom. Until our next discussion, have a great night.